Hello, this is a sneak preview of the audiobook version of The Shorelines by David Baker. Chapter 1. Old Panna, the Rich and the Rotten. As it always seemed to be, the new day came with a deluge of rain. It poured into the grim streets of Panna with heavy drops, ice cold and seemingly constant. It had been a harsh winter for the sorry folk who were bonded to this decayed old borough. Snow still lay on the higher hills that surrounded the outlying farmland, and the ground was sodden with water from the continual downpours. Built on a natural rise in the ground called Pan, overlooking once lush farmland and river courses, Panna had stood proud atop the hill that gave the town its name for generations, a settlement first set in stone long before war or hardship ever touched its boundaries. Surrounded by a high stone curtain wall with a single gateway to the southeast, Panna was now officially sectioned off into 4 key areas. The inner palace at the centre, where the overseer and his entourage lived and ruled, containing just one large fortified circular house of white stone and large windows. 4 watchtowers mark each corner, surrounded by barns and impenetrable half-buried treasury buildings. It was in these fortress-like buildings that the fruits of the citizens' labours were taken to be taxed, measured and sold, all for the profit of the overseer. At the centre of this collection of buildings was a well that was off-limits to the lowly ward dwellers. Between the inner palace and the next ward was a 30-foot deep ditch containing gibbets and garbage thrown in to create a moat of cess and death between the town and the unscrupulous authorities. Execution was more commonplace in Pala, but as the workers dwindled after mass killings for sedition or theft spiraled, the list of capital offences shrunk with the population. The next ward was a secure ring of workshops and industry, the remnants of its manufacturing past. No one lived here apart from the town guard by order of the overseer. Even the tools of the craftsmen were left here at the end of each day for security reasons. However, it was no hardship to the workers, as it was a fetid shithole, long since polluted and blackened with the soot of decades of burning forges and kilns, a grim and oppressive monument to the greed that had enslaved the town. In the secondary ward, known as the Maze to its inhabitants, the craftsmen and their families lived in tenement blocks of wood and wattle. Animal dung and mud were used to seal the walls from the elements. A rambling circle of interweaving roads and laneways gave this place its apt nickname. Only very few of the inhabitants could draw you a map of the complete ward. It was relatively peaceful in this zone of the town, mainly due to there being food and water. However, the only water supply to the thousands living in Panna flowed via a vast aqueduct, carrying the precious liquid from the river Nub on the outer edge of the surrounding farmland. This water was highly taxed and could only be collected by the cup, not by the bucket load. The only citizens that could live here are workers and their families, a middle class inner ward. The workers were all skilled craftsmen, from metal to textiles. They could produce pretty much anything that was ordered. Yet for these workers were not permitted to undertake any contract of their own. Every day as the sun set, a bell was tolled from the palace towers, signalling the craftsmen to go home. They were under orders to leave all their tools behind, so that no one could have anything that could be perceived as a weapon in the town. No one in the ward was permitted to even own a knife to cut their bread. Revolutionary speech or any breach of these rules were met with an immediate reprimand by the Panna guard. The outer ward was once a giant stock pen for animals and produce from agriculture, but it had been transformed into a shanty town, populated by the unemployed, the sick and the old. Orphans with no trade to inherit ended up here in their hundreds. The only way these dregs could survive in the feudal society that they were doomed to exist in was by forced labour, an underclass shunned by the rich and pitied by the working men. Choice of work did not exist for these hapless souls. Forced to toil in the vast fields that once fed the entire region, tilling fields of waterlogged clay to grow crops that they never tasted. For their toil they were paid in food only. Once every 5 days they were allowed a meal, just enough to keep these emaciated husks easily controlled. A draconian rule was enforced that for every meal they earned as payment they had to hand 1 spoonful back to the overseer as a penance tax, as burdens on the town. This was a foul time for all, but these poor creatures, barely recognisable as people, had it worst. Any sign of insurrection would invariably result in banishment or even death. Considering the harsh realities of living outside the walls, many would welcome death as a blessed relief. Panna was an old town, formerly rich in tradition and heritage, but it had long since passed. Gone were the days of smoke rising from the multiple workshops where fine metalwork was made for trade across the lands, where merchants could buy and sell of their own volition. Famous for its weapons and trinkets, Panna once grew rich and fat from its reputation for excellence and fair trade. Guilds of all classes propped up the economy, each bearing the arms of each trade. Blacksmiths and jewellers, cutlers and smelters, all flocked here for apprenticeship and prestige. But that was a long time ago. A generation passed in squalor under a new regime, a regime based on greed and a singular power. It began with an election. Elections for the position of overseer were called once every 5 years, or if the previous incumbent had died. The overseer, called Wellan, died under suspicious circumstances, and many presumed he had been dispatched in a coup by wealthy traders vying for power. Panna was originally formed as a democracy by its founders, yet bore little resemblance anymore. It had slowly become poisoned by the lust for riches and, more importantly, power. One family seemed to dominate these elections, the family of Wen. Formerly metal workers and merchants who grew incredibly wealthy compared to their counterparts, the guilds were not encouraged by Wen to vote for him at the start. But promises of wealth and abundance, and also stories of Wen's influence outside their little world, swung the election in his favour. However, instead of staying in office for his elected 5 years, Wen took matters into his own hands. Hired thugs suddenly entered the wards, mercenaries that would serve anyone for the right price. These mainly brainless drones were given the right to enter any place or business or dwelling to enforce order. The original lands where the guards came from was unknown, but come they did in their hundreds. First they took up residence in a camp outside the walls. This vicus only lasted a short time, for they entered the town and never left. Wen became sole benefactor of the profits of old Panna. From the metalwork to the grain in the field, he insisted on a tax to be paid by each worker or citizen. His ruse was that this payment was for the upkeep and safety of the walls and the aqueduct. But no one ever saw that treasure leave the now towering palace-like building in the inner motte. The town began to change, from a pleasant place full of bustling streets, trade and plenty, into an oppressive regime based on class and status. With Wen at the top, beneath him his guards, the craftsmen, and then everyone else. The guilds that had given Panna its great wealth and trading tradition were dissolved in a purge. Now only Wen was in control of raw materials and resources like fuel. The traders left the town alone on the old hollow ways and roads that used to meander close to the town gates. No one wanted to pay over the odds for the work done under this system. The guild banners were taken down one night and supposedly buried in a ceremonial funeral for commerce on the banks of the River Nub. All trade, was absurdly justified by inheritance, by law. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, you had to prove that 7 generations of your family had worked the same forge all that time. Anyone could not prove their lineage or was without children past the age of 40 were forcibly taken from their home into the outer ward and publicly shamed in the process. The outer ward became densely packed. Adults slept in the open and children slept sometimes 6 at a time in old grain sacks and ale barrels. Disease and sickness was widespread as the dozens became hundreds and the hundreds became thousands. Penned together like cattle not fit for market. Being in this predicament, they could also not avail themselves of the water from the aqueduct. Instead, they dug deep pits to collect rainwater to drink. Alas, these were often contaminated with piss and other matter from the menagerie of vermin that they shared this awful stage with. Here in this slum of slums was a young man. Gilu was only 22 years old. His mother died in childbirth, his father an anonymous rapist. This heritage of shame in the eyes of the town of Old Panna decided his fate with his first cries out of the womb. How he survived into adolescence is unclear, but it is apparent that someone was guiding him in his early life. Often he pondered what it'd be like to live in the other ward and dreamt of becoming a blade maker. But he knew his place, his dishonour and his fate. Gilu was a popular face around the slums, as he would often covertly snare rabbits in the field while doing his farming duties. These he would share if he could. However, the penalty for this crime was harsh, as they all knew. They couldn't be seen to cook anything. They all inevitably developed a taste for raw rabbit. Gilu was taller than most in the outer ward, roughly 6 foot tall, quite broad, although he was still a pasty-skinned bag of bones like the others. All he saw of life was the town walls, the slop hut, which they had named the mess hall, and his pit, which he had dug to sleep in. He always imagined that this would one day become his grave. Like most of the others, he never put much thought into the outside world and the other people or places. Yet he would dream he was in vast cities surrounded by knights and golden halls. Even his dreams became a poverty-stricken cliché. He was often handed the toughest jobs because of his relative strength to the others in the fields, moving bales of hay or pulling a plough if there were no animals available. He grinned and bared it, but was fully aware that his criminal heritage, as they called it, demanded an eventual death sentence for him and everyone he ever knew. But there was no great liberator coming to the aid of Panna. It seemed as though he, alongside the rest of his dishevelled class, were doomed to an early grave, a forgotten class, slaves to power and greed. One Monday morning, he was awoken with a dismissive kick by the Panna guard. He noticed that for once the dawn broke without the usual rain and gloomy grey skies he was accustomed to. He looked up and for one brief moment felt the warmth of the new spring day on his face. It felt like being bathed in pure life, an elixir from beyond this world. Then the clouds returned in the shape of the sole of the guard's boot coming down on his face. "Wake up, you bastard, there's work to be done," granted the fat-faced guard with all the humility of a dead rat. Okay, Gilu replied. I'm on my way," which was always said in a forlorn tone, as he was pretty much an everyday occurrence. They marched him away into the long queue of those selected for toil that day. The line looked like the outside of a battlefield hospital. People barely able to walk and bleeding, some naked as they traded their clothes for scraps. Gilu thought to himself, "This can't go on much longer, surely." He would be proven right that morning for sure. Nothing would be the same again, for him at least. While waiting to be led into the fields and collect their blunted tools for the day's back-breaking labour, he heard a loud proclamation from behind him. "Get out of the fucking way! Make way for Wen!" Suddenly he heard thundering hooves and saw the crowd of workers parting like soil after the plough. "You bitch, get the fuck out of the way, or you won't be fed this week," said a guard to an old woman who Jilu knew. She was most likely in her 70s and, unbeknownst to the guard, completely deaf. The guard proceeded to strike her. As the rest of the line, fearing reprisals, looked away, Jilu ran to her aid. "Please, sir, she's deaf and very old," implored Jilu. But the guard drew his sword and tried to swing at her from behind. Jilu grabbed the guard's arm but was met with a hard kick to the head, courtesy of Wen from his horse. "Guard, arrest that lanky prick now," Wen pronounced, "and tie that old cow to the post. She's mine." Jilu was knocked unconscious but was awoken by another ugly guard pissing on his head. "Looks like rain after all, lads," he joked, and the pack of guards was stricken with a bout of uncontrollable laughter at this ugly bastard's rapier-like wit. Wen dismounted his horse, took a knife from his scabbard and held it to the old woman's throat. As a final insult, he spat in her face. This made the guards almost implode with maudlin laughter. Jilu, now conscious, thought, "What cunts," stood back on his feet. The guards, distracted by their paying master's act of sheer bravery, didn't notice Jilu remove a knife from the boot of his former incontinent captor. In 2 large strides he was behind Wen, with the knife to his throat. "How does it fucking feel, you evil bastard?" he whispered in the ear of Wen, the once all-powerful overseer of Panna. Soiled himself on the spot. "There now, you smell just like the rest of us for once, Wen," whispered Jilu. Wen was shaken with both fear and rage, and called to the guards, "Grab him, you lazy bastards!" They obliged and ripped Jilu away from Wen, but not before Jilu ran the knife across the cheek of Wen's face. He sliced him from mouth to ear, and blood pumped from the wound as Wen shrieked in pain. They forced Jilu to the ground and kicked him into a stupor. Wen ordered that he be made an example of. However, fearing the rabble might make him into a martyr if he killed him, he made the following proclamation to the crowd. "This bastard wretch is no longer to be accepted within these walls. He is not part of you or this great town anymore. He has stood in the way of justice and failed you all, because now you shall all go without food this week." The crowd jeered. "Furthermore, he has assaulted your beloved overseer in plain sight of you all." The crowd now surged forward and started throwing missiles at Jilu. Wen continued, "If you want to get any food this month, you must carry out justice. Think of all the people that will starve among you." Jilu awoke to see the old woman having her throat slit by his own. They covered themselves in her blood. Some were seen to drink from the wound. He thought he was next for the knife. The frenzy of the masses around him was terrifying. The cacophony of shouting and gurgling bloodlust sickened him. The line from where he lunged advanced towards him and picked him up over their shoulders, shouting, "Banish! Banish! Banish! Banish!" They threw him onto a cart and tied him down hard to the splintered wooden boards. A frenzy of faces flashed in front of his eyes, spitting and showing their yellow teeth like pack animals. A horse was tied to the cart, and before the poor beast could protest, its rump was whipped hard. It reared up on its hind legs, kicked and spat, and bolted from the town gate. Into the fields the cart flew uncontrollably, over the furrows and bouncing across the muddy ditches. The panicked horse dragged his human cargo for miles. Jilu repeatedly smashed his head off the cart with every bounce and passed out. He awoke to silence, the cart now on its side and the horse dead. Clearly he had fallen into a crevice and died. He couldn't hear any mob justice or jeers anymore. All he could hear was the buzzing of flies and a lonely wind howling in the distance. Still tied to the cart tightly and now hanging sideways, helplessly dangling with no one to help him, he feared he would die and tried to remember that rare sunrise he'd seen that morning. It gave him a comforting thought. Even if that thought was his last, he would at least know it was a good one. Jilu slipped into unconsciousness, slowly only knowing that he wouldn't awake this time. He had given up hope. Darkness crept into his peripheral vision. He saw the world through an ever-darkening, gloomy tunnel.